The room fell silent as George Soros leaned forward, his piercing eyes locked on Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett. The world held its breath. Every camera in the room seemed to zoom in on the moment. His voice, calm and calculated, cut through the tension. "You're no patriot," he said, his words like a slap in the face. "Not in the true sense of the word. Your loyalty, your actions, they betray everything this country stands for." The words hung in the air, thick with disdain. The crowd shifted uncomfortably. Some gasped. Others leaned in, waiting for her response. This was no ordinary exchange. This wasn't just a debate, it was an open assault on Crockett's character, her very identity as an American. Crockett stood tall, her back straight, her gaze unwavering. She knew this moment wasn't just about her. It was about something much bigger. This was the powerful, wealthy elite, men like Soros, challenging the very essence of who she was, what she represented, and what millions of Americans believed in. Her lips parted, but for a second, she hesitated. Not because she was afraid, but because the weight of what was happening in that room hit her hard. But she was ready. The cameras flashed, the crowd gasped, and in that moment, the battle for America's soul began. Her voice broke the silence, calm but filled with fire. "This isn't just an attack on me, George. It's an attack on every person who's ever fought for this country, who's ever stood up to be counted. It's an attack on the ideals that built this nation." Soros smirked. "And what, exactly, are those ideals?" Crockett didn't flinch. "The ones you've long since forgotten. Justice. Equality. The belief that no matter where you come from, you deserve to be treated with dignity." A wave of energy rippled through the room. It wasn't just a debate anymore. This was a clash of ideologies, a confrontation of two Americas, and only one could emerge victorious. The stakes had never been higher. The tension in the room wasn't just about the exchange between Soros and Crockett. It was about a far deeper battle, a collision of two competing visions for the future of America. And the world was watching. George Soros wasn't just a name in the political sphere, he was a force, a global titan whose wealth and influence shaped the very framework of American politics. A billionaire philanthropist, Soros had long used his fortune to back causes that aligned with his progressive ideology. But behind that veneer of charity lay something far darker. His relentless push to fund political campaigns, sway elections, and influence policies had made him a polarizing figure. To some, he was a champion of global progress, to others, a puppet master pulling strings from behind the scenes. Soros had spent decades shaping the narrative, making backroom deals, funding political movements that tilted the scales in favor of the elites. He didn't just donate money, he crafted the narrative of what was right and wrong in America. And in his eyes, anyone who stood in opposition to that, especially someone like Jasmine Crockett, was an obstacle to progress. But Crockett was no ordinary Congresswoman. She didn't belong to the well-heeled circles Soros often frequented. She didn't have the luxury of millions to fund a campaign or the political clout that came with decades of insider influence. Crockett was a woman of the people, the very embodiment of a political outsider. She rose from the gritty streets of Dallas, from a background where every dollar counted, where every decision meant something, and where service to the public was the highest honor. In Congress, she had quickly earned a reputation as a fearless advocate for justice and equality. But it wasn't just her words that set her apart, it was her actions. She fought for affordable healthcare, better schools, and higher wages for the working class. She challenged the system at every turn, confronting not just Republicans, but members of her own party who had forgotten the people they were meant to serve. She was an anomaly in Washington, a breath of fresh air in a system suffocated by money and corruption. And now, here she was, standing face to face with one of the most powerful men in the world, accused of betraying her country. Soros's challenge wasn't just personal, it was an attack on everything she stood for. He represented a world of global elites, of corporations and billionaires who had long dictated the rules of the game. Crockett, in her own way, represented the counterbalance, the working-class Americans, immigrants, and marginalized communities who had been left behind. The moment hung in the air, heavy with significance. This wasn't just a political spat. It was a clash of ideologies. Soros, the man who had spent billions to shape the future, versus Crockett, a woman who had spent her life fighting to give a voice to those who had none. One stood for a vision of power, wealth, and globalism, the other for a vision of justice, dignity, and the American dream. The cameras rolled. The pundits waited. The stakes were higher than ever. But what happened next would leave the country divided. Could this moment be the turning point in the battle for America's future? Was this the confrontation that would tip the scales, forcing America to choose between the power of the elite and the power of the people? For every supporter of Crockett, this was the fight they had been waiting for, the fight for dignity, for justice, for an America that belonged to all, not just the powerful few. For Soros, this was a moment to tighten his grip, to remind the world of who controlled the narrative. But the world wasn't ready for what was coming. And neither was Soros. George Soros didn't just make his billions from smart investments, he made them by controlling the game itself. Born in Hungary to a Jewish family, his early life was marked by hardship. He escaped the horrors of World War II and the oppressive regime of the Soviet Union, experiences that undeniably shaped his worldview. But those early struggles faded fast as Soros rose to prominence, first as a financier, then as a political strategist, and eventually as one of the wealthiest men on the planet. Soros wasn't just a businessman, he became a kingmaker. His fortune didn't just buy him luxury, it bought him influence. Real, lasting influence. He was the mastermind behind billions of dollars in donations to political causes, to political candidates, and to social movements that aligned with his grand vision of a more open society. A vision where borders were porous, where power was distributed to global institutions, and where wealth and influence were reshaped by those who, in his mind, could see the bigger picture. For Soros, the political system wasn't something to be respected or worked within, it was something to be manipulated, bent to his will. Through his Open Society foundations, he funneled vast sums into efforts to reshape governments, to influence elections, to push policies that furthered his interests. He was not content to simply observe from the sidelines, he had to be the one pulling the strings. To him, the average American citizen was nothing more than a piece on a chessboard, one that could be sacrificed for the greater good of globalism. He didn't see them as individuals with dreams and struggles, they were statistics, data points to be analyzed and shifted in favor of his larger goals. When the masses rebelled against his worldview, when they resisted the policies he championed, it was a mere inconvenience. Soros was above such petty concerns. In the halls of Washington, Soros's name evoked both fear and admiration. His political donations were a virtual guarantee that a candidate would owe him something. They might not speak his name in public, but behind closed doors, they knew, Soros could make or break careers. His power wasn't just in his wealth, but in his ability to quietly steer the course of political discourse. But it wasn't just American politics he sought to control. His influence stretched across continents, from the European Union to developing nations. He backed pro-democracy movements, not for the sake of the people, but to ensure that governments conformed to his ideals. He once called the collapse of the British pound in 1992 a victory. He had broken a country's currency in a single day, all for personal gain, and he had done it without a second thought. There was no moral hesitation, no consideration for the people who would feel the economic consequences. To Soros, the world was a series of variables to be manipulated. People were disposable. This was the man who now stood at odds with Jasmine Crockett. To him, she was just another pawn, another politician to be swayed or discarded. He dismissed her not just because she was an upstart, but because she represented everything he despised, an unfiltered voice from the people, untainted by the elite networks he so meticulously cultivated. She was a reminder of what he could never understand, the authenticity of real struggle. What Soros couldn't see, and what he refused to acknowledge, was that the world wasn't just a game to be won. It was a place of real people, with real stakes. The battle for America's future was not about manipulating systems for power, it was about ensuring that the voices of everyday people were heard, that their struggles were acknowledged, and that their hopes were not crushed under the weight of elitist agendas. Soros's arrogance ran deep, far beyond his personal wealth. It wasn't just that he believed in his own genius, it was that he believed the world was his to shape, and anyone who stood in his way was simply an obstacle to be removed. His wealth, his influence, his vast network of supporters, these things made him feel invincible. He was a man who had shaped nations, toppled currencies, and manipulated entire political systems. His legacy was one of influence and control, and he viewed those who challenged him as naive fools. But what Soros failed to realize was that there was something he had overlooked in his calculations. Something more powerful than money, more unyielding than influence. And that something had just stepped into the spotlight. Jasmine Crockett wasn't just another politician with a platform. She was the voice of the very people Soros had long since abandoned. She wasn't part of the elite circles that Soros played in. She wasn't bought and sold by political donations or backroom deals. She was someone who understood the real struggles of working-class Americans, immigrants, and people from marginalized communities. Soros's mistake. He had underestimated her, and by doing so, he had underestimated the power of the very people he had spent decades trying to control. He had picked the wrong target. Jasmine Crockett wasn't born into a world of privilege or power. She was born into struggle, a child of the streets of Dallas, Texas, where every day was a fight. The Crockett family didn't have much. They didn't have fancy cars or sprawling homes. They had what they needed, and nothing more. Her parents worked tirelessly to make sure she had a chance, even if that chance came with sweat, sacrifice, and endless hours of hard work. Her mother, a nurse, worked the night shifts to care for others, while her father, a mechanic, worked long hours in a garage, fixing cars that were barely worth the parts they used. Yet, they still managed to instill in Jasmine something priceless, a belief that no matter where you came from, you could rise if you were willing to work hard enough. Their sacrifices fueled her drive, their unspoken love became the foundation upon which she built her own dreams. But it wasn't just their work ethic that shaped Jasmine. It was the neighborhood she grew up in, where she witnessed the failures of a system that was supposed to protect its citizens. It was the struggles of her friends, the stories of immigrants who had risked everything for a shot at the American dream, only to find that dream was a lot harder to attain than they had been told. And it was the quiet desperation in the faces of the families who were too afraid to speak up, too worried that the system would crush them if they dared challenge it. By the time Jasmine graduated from law school, she had already seen enough of the world's unfairness to know what she was meant to do. She didn't go into law to make money or gain status, she went into law to fight. She became a public defender, representing those the system had forgotten, those who couldn't afford a fancy attorney, those whose voices were drowned out by the powerful, the wealthy, and the politically connected. Every case she took on, every client she fought for, reminded her why she had entered the legal field in the first place. She took on cases that others wouldn't dare touch. The forgotten, the downtrodden, the ones who were presumed guilty before they even entered the courtroom. Jasmine didn't just see these people as clients, she saw them as her family. She saw them as the very essence of what America was supposed to stand for: equality, fairness, and justice. But this wasn't just about legal battles. It was about a personal crusade. Jasmine had been raised to understand that justice wasn't something you could rely on to just happen. It was something you had to demand, something you had to fight for, something that wasn't guaranteed to come your way unless you forced it to. And so, when she stood up in courtrooms, in city halls, in the halls of Congress, it wasn't just to represent the law, it was to represent every person who had ever been told they didn't matter. Her rise to Congress wasn't some neat political career path paved with backroom deals and elite connections. It was a fight, pure and simple. She entered politics not to become a politician, but to shake up a system that was broken beyond repair. She was the fresh voice that Washington had tried to silence for years. A product of the working class, of immigrants, of people who had lived in the margins and had learned the hard way that if you didn't stand up, you would get trampled. She wasn't there to play the game, she was there to change the rules. But the higher she climbed, the more she realized that the very forces she had spent her career fighting against were now watching her every move. Those who had used wealth and power to manipulate the system were threatened by her, and they didn't care how they had to take her down. And when George Soros, one of the world's wealthiest and most influential men, publicly attacked her, it wasn't just a political dispute. It was an attack on everything she stood for. It was an attack on the principles of justice and equality that had fueled her entire life. And it was an attack on the very people who had trusted her to fight for them. Her supporters rallied behind her, of course, but the fight had grown bigger than anyone could have imagined. Soros, with his vast network and endless resources, was a man who could buy influence and shape policy. He had spent years manipulating the system for his own gain. He had the power to topple governments, destroy careers, and create entire movements from the shadows. And yet, Jasmine Crockett wasn't afraid. She wasn't backing down. Her mother had always told her that no matter how hard life got, there was one thing that could never be taken from her, her integrity. That was what kept her going in the darkest hours. That was what kept her grounded when the world around her seemed to be unraveling. The struggle was personal for Jasmine, it was her family, her community, and her fight for justice. And now, standing in front of Soros, she knew one thing: this fight wasn't just about her anymore. It was about every single person who had ever been told they didn't belong, every person who had been silenced by the elites, and every person who had been told their voice didn't matter. Soros might have billions, but Jasmine Crockett had something far more powerful: the unwavering support of the people, and a fierce belief in what was right. This moment, this battle, was the culmination of everything she had worked for. And if anyone was going to take her down, they would have to rip everything she believed in from her hands, and they would have to do it in front of the entire country. She wasn't born into wealth, but she was born with a fight inside her. And that fight was about to take center stage. The tension in the room was palpable, the air thick with anticipation. It was clear to everyone present that this wasn't just a debate, it was a war of ideologies. On one side, George Soros, the billionaire financier with decades of global influence, and on the other, Jasmine Crockett, the rising star in Congress who represented the voice of the people. The stage had been set for a clash of titans. Soros, sitting comfortably in his chair, had the air of someone who had seen it all. His hands rested lightly on the desk in front of him, his posture relaxed, as though he were above the very concept of this debate. His voice was smooth, condescending. He spoke as though Crockett was beneath him, an errant student who needed to be reminded of the bigger picture. Jasmine, I understand your desire to be the voice of the people, but the reality is far more complicated than you seem to grasp, Soros began, his words laced with that signature arrogance. You see, the world doesn't function on idealism alone. It's about power, real, tangible power, and how you use it. It's about shaping policy to protect the future of our country, even if that means making difficult, unpopular choices. Crockett's eyes narrowed, her jaw tight. She wasn't here to be lectured by a man who saw the world as his personal chessboard. She had heard enough of that rhetoric to last a lifetime. With a calm, yet unmistakably sharp, tone, she responded. Don't mistake idealism for inexperience, George, she said. What you call shaping policy, I call manipulating people. You use your money to bend the system to your will, to serve your own agenda. But that's not leadership. That's control. The room shifted. Soros's smirk faltered, just for a fraction of a second. But it was enough to let everyone know this wasn't going as smoothly as he'd expected. He leaned forward, trying to regain his position, to assert his dominance. Control. Soros scoffed. Do you really believe you can save the country, Jasmine? Your ideals are nothing but an illusion. The system we've built, what you call manipulation, has kept the world stable. You may think that people like me don't understand the struggles of everyday Americans, but let me tell you something, I know how the world works. And it's people like you, with your misplaced populism, who endanger that stability. Crockett's gaze didn't waver. She was unshaken, resolute. Her voice was quieter now, but it carried weight. Stability? She asked, her words slow, deliberate. Stability for who, George? The billionaires who think they can buy their way out of accountability? The politicians who keep pushing the same broken policies while the rest of America drowns? You see, that's where you're wrong. It's not about your idea of stability. It's about dignity. The dignity of every person who works hard, who struggles to make ends meet, who fights for their families, who dreams of a better future. Soros leaned back, his eyes narrowing, and for the first time, there was a flicker of uncertainty in his gaze. He had underestimated her. In his world, people like Crockett were easy to ignore, easy to dismiss. But she wasn't backing down. She wasn't afraid. The truth is, Crockett continued, her voice now rising, you've lived your whole life thinking that money and influence are the answer to everything. But you're wrong. This isn't just a game of numbers for us, it's our lives. And for the first time in a long time, the people who you've ignored, the ones you've dismissed as insignificant, they're awake. They see you for what you really are. Soros sneered. And what exactly is that, Jasmine? A fighter for a lost cause? No, Crockett replied, her words sharp like a blade. A fighter for the people who've been silenced by your kind. The crowd was on edge now. The insults were flying, but Crockett remained composed, her resolve growing stronger by the second. Soros tried to regain control, his voice rising, more biting, as he lashed out. You're naive, Jasmine. You don't understand the complexities of the world. You think you can just dismantle the system, but the system is what holds us all together. Without it, there would be chaos. Chaos? Crockett responded. What do you call the chaos your system has created? The inequality? The injustice? The fact that millions of people in this country are just trying to survive, while you sit at the top, pulling the strings? That's not stability, George. That's oppression. For a moment, it felt like the room itself was holding its breath. Soros was on the defensive, his calm demeanor slipping. The balance of power was shifting, and for the first time, it wasn't in his favor. He tried one last time, his voice trembling with frustration. You're a fool if you think this country can be governed by ideals alone. But Crockett didn't flinch. She leaned forward slightly, locking eyes with him. Maybe it's time you realized, George, that the people are tired of being governed by men like you. The room fell silent. The clash of ideologies had reached a fever pitch, and it was clear to everyone that this wasn't just a debate anymore. This was a battle for the future. But in that moment, something happened that Soros never saw coming. The silence in the room stretched on, heavy with anticipation. Soros's words, laced with condescension and arrogance, had barely settled, but Jasmine Crockett wasn't done. She didn't flinch. She didn't rush. She didn't need to. Her eyes, calm but unwavering, held Soros as if she were looking past him, not at the man, but at the very system he represented. She stood there for a moment, letting the tension build, the crowd waiting for her response. There was no bravado in her stance. There was no flurry of heated words. Just a quiet confidence that spoke volumes more than any insult could. And then, when she spoke, her voice was measured, steady, each word carrying the weight of 1,000 unseen battles. George, you talk about the system like it's something beyond reproach, something we're supposed to simply accept, she began, her voice carrying through the room with a calm authority. You sit here, with your wealth, your connections, your global influence, and you expect the rest of us to believe that the world is fine, that we should just fall in line. The audience was on the edge of their seats. They had heard Soros's condescension, his talk of power and stability, but now they were hearing something else. Something different. Crockett's words cut through the veneer of elitism like a hot knife through butter. You speak of stability, George, she continued, her gaze never leaving his. But what you call stability is nothing but a system built on inequality. A system where people like you sit at the top, making billions off the backs of those who can barely afford to eat, let alone dream. A system where the working-class American, the immigrant, the single mother, all those who actually keep this country running, are left to fight for scraps, while you and your billionaire friends buy influence and control. The crowd shifted, murmurs rippling through the audience. Crockett's words were piercing, and the clarity of her message was undeniable. She wasn't just speaking to Soros anymore, she was speaking to everyone who had ever felt like they didn't matter, to everyone who had ever been overlooked by the powerful. You want to talk about privilege, George? She asked, her voice rising just a fraction. Let's talk about your privilege. Let's talk about how you got where you are, not by working alongside the people, but by bending systems, manipulating economies, and buying politicians. You didn't get to the top by earning your way, no, you got there by stacking the deck, by using your billions to tip the scales in your favor, to control the narrative and the policy. And all while you pretend to be the benevolent benefactor, the savior of the world. Soros's face had tightened, the confident smirk that had once sat so comfortably on his lips now gone, replaced with a flicker of discomfort. He had never expected this. No one had ever dared to challenge him like this, to speak so openly about his manipulation of the very systems he claimed to uphold. Let me remind you of something, George, Crockett continued, her words now laced with a quiet fury. The American people didn't get their independence by playing it safe. We didn't get our freedoms by bowing to men like you. We fought for them. We built this country, brick by brick, sweat and blood, and we've never once asked for handouts. We've never once relied on someone like you to tell us what's best for us. The people who you ignore every day, they're the ones who put food on the table. They're the ones who keep the lights on in your offices, in your cities, in your world. The weight of her words hit like a wave. The crowd, sensing the shift in the air, began to murmur in agreement. This wasn't just an attack on Soros, it was an attack on the very system that had kept so many down for so long. The system that had allowed the rich to thrive at the expense of the poor. And let's be real, George, Crockett said, her tone softening, but no less deadly. You've lived a life of comfort, of privilege, of endless resources at your disposal. You've never had to look over your shoulder, wondering if the next paycheck will cover your rent. You've never had to choose between buying groceries or paying for your child's medicine. You've never been told that you don't belong, that your voice doesn't matter. You've never known what it's like to fight for your country, to fight for your dignity, because for you, the world has always bent to your will. Soros shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his fingers twitching ever so slightly, a nervous energy creeping in. He was used to being the one who commanded the room, the one who set the narrative. But here, Crockett wasn't just challenging his words, she was challenging his entire worldview. And that's why you don't get it, George. You've spent your whole life above it all. You've spent your life building a world that's meant to keep people like you on top. But what you didn't count on is the fact that the people are waking up. The ones you've ignored, the ones you've dismissed, they see the system for what it really is. And they're done being controlled. They're done being told that their fight doesn't matter. The room was silent, but the energy was palpable. Every eye in the room was now fixed on Soros. For the first time, it was clear he was no longer in control of the narrative. Crockett had flipped the script, exposing his privilege and revealing the dark truth behind his public persona. She didn't just defend herself, she defended every American who had ever been overlooked, every immigrant who had ever been told they weren't welcome, every worker who had been left behind. Soros, once so confident, now looked unsettled, his face stiff with frustration. His power, his wealth, his influence, none of it could protect him from the undeniable truth Crockett had just laid bare. And then, as the room buzzed with disbelief and murmurs of agreement, Crockett took a step back, her gaze still locked on Soros. She knew the fight wasn't over, but in this moment, she had made her point. She had delivered the mic drop moment that would define this confrontation. But what happened next sent shockwaves across the nation. The moment Crockett delivered her counterattack, the world seemed to freeze, and then it exploded. Within minutes, Twitter was ablaze. Hashtags like hashtag Crockett the Patriot and hashtag Dignity Over Money began trending. Her words reverberated across the internet, shared by millions who had witnessed the raw power of her response. Tweets poured in from across the political spectrum, some praising her brilliance, others questioning the very system Soros represented. But the overwhelming majority were unequivocal: Crockett had just done something that many had thought impossible. She had stood up to the elite, and she had won. Jasmine Crockett just showed us what real courage looks like. Hashtag Crockett the Patriot, one tweet read, with thousands of retweets. George Soros thought he could bully her, but Crockett turned the tables. A true American hero. Hashtag Dignity Over Money, another post echoed. It wasn't just ordinary citizens who were moved. Celebrities, influencers, and political commentators flooded the social media platforms to weigh in. Actor Michael B. Jordan tweeted, "This is what real leadership looks like. I'm with it, Jasmine Crockett all the way." Even media outlets who had previously been hesitant to give Crockett the time of day couldn't ignore her impact. CNN's Jake Tapper tweeted, "Jasmine Crockett just turned the tables in this debate. Soros might have billions, but she has the truth." But the social media frenzy didn't stop there. The memes began to flood in, Soros's smug face being replaced with captions like, "When the rich find out they're not invincible." Viral videos of Crockett's mic drop moment were everywhere, replayed and dissected by viewers who were captivated by the courage she had shown. As the hashtags multiplied, the political world was thrown into a frenzy. The establishment's usual response to a moment like this would have been swift and decisive, dismissing it as a fluke, or downplaying its significance. But this time, something was different. Soros's camp tried to spin the narrative, but the damage had been done. The elite were no longer in control of the message. Soros's spokesperson, a well-dressed political strategist, appeared on every news channel trying to salvage the situation, but every attempt to diminish Crockett's triumph only fueled the fire. Jasmine Crockett's response was emotional and misguided. "She's playing to the populist crowd," the spokesperson said, trying to redirect the conversation. "This isn't about her personal attack. This is about policy, about the future of this country." But the damage was already irreversible. People weren't just hearing Soros's words anymore, they were feeling them. The people who had been ignored for so long, the ones who had spent years watching the elite puppet masters pull the strings of Washington, were beginning to realize something. They were not powerless. The more Soros's camp tried to spin the narrative, the more the public rallied behind Crockett. The truth she spoke, that wasn't just an attack on Soros, it was an attack on everything that kept the elite in power. It was a statement that the people were no longer willing to be ignored, no longer willing to be pawns in a game they never agreed to play. And Crockett had given them the voice they so desperately needed. The ripple effect wasn't just on social media, it spilled into real-world political discourse. Progressive groups, unions, and grassroots organizations all jumped in to support her. Marches were organized. Fundraisers began pouring in for her re-election campaign, and her endorsement became one of the most coveted in the Democratic Party. But the support wasn't without its detractors. Conservative pundits immediately began questioning Crockett's motives. Fox News's Tucker Carlson accused her of undermining America's global position by challenging Soros. Jasmine Crockett is leading us down a dangerous path of populism. This kind of rhetoric will only divide this country more, he warned, trying to shift the conversation back to the dangers of her message. Yet, despite the pushback, Crockett's supporters were energized. They saw her not just as a congresswoman, but as a symbol of resistance against the entrenched power that had too long ruled over their lives. The public validation they had longed for was finally here, and it wasn't just in the form of Crockett's words, but in her ability to connect with the very real, everyday struggles they faced. Her words had ignited something inside them, hope. Hope that, perhaps, things could be different. Hope that someone like her, someone who had walked in their shoes, could fight back against the forces that had shaped their lives for so long. The conversation had shifted. The narrative was no longer just about Soros's power, it was about the people's power. But even as the nation rallied behind her, even as her message of dignity and justice spread like wildfire, one question remained. The political establishment had been shaken. The power dynamics had been disrupted. Would Soros strike back? The world was waiting, holding its collective breath. If history was any guide, the billionaire wasn't the kind of man to let an attack like this go unanswered. He had spent years building his empire, would he allow some congresswoman to ruin it? The cameras had gone silent. The crowds had begun to dissipate, but Jasmine Crockett stood there, alone for just a moment, allowing herself a brief pause. She looked around the room, her gaze steady. What had just transpired wasn't just a personal victory for her, it was something much larger. She felt the weight of the moment, but also the sense of something beginning to shift. This wasn't just about a debate or an attack on a billionaire's ego. It was about the very foundation of what America stood for, and what it still had the potential to be. Crockett turned toward the audience, her voice now quieter, but with even more conviction. I didn't stand up here today to defend myself. I stood up here to defend something greater. This isn't about one person or one moment. This is about who we are as a country. This is about our values, the values that this nation was built on, freedom, justice, and the pursuit of dignity for every single person, no matter where they come from. Her words resonated, their weight becoming clear. She wasn't attacking Soros, she was attacking a system that allowed his kind to thrive at the expense of the rest. She wasn't standing up for herself, she was standing up for everyone who had ever been told they didn't belong, everyone who had ever been pushed to the margins of society because they weren't rich enough, influential enough, or connected enough. This moment, this battle, it's not just mine, she continued, her voice stronger now, it's for every American who has been ignored, overlooked, and forgotten. The people who work day in and day out, just trying to make a living, trying to put food on the table for their families. The people who believe that the American dream is not some abstract ideal, but a reality they can work toward, no matter their background. This fight is for them. Her words hung in the air, the truth of them settling in. The audience could feel it. This wasn't just another political speech. This was a rallying cry for a nation that had grown tired of the elites, the power structures, and the corruption that had long run the show. It was a call to arms for the people who had been silenced for so long. The ones who had been made to feel like their voices didn't matter, that their struggles were invisible. But now, in this moment, Crockett had given them something powerful, validation. This fight is about the dignity we all deserve. It's about a country where every person has the right to be seen, to be heard, to be respected, Crockett said, her eyes now sweeping across the room. This is about us, not them. This is about making sure that every person, no matter their race, their gender, their income, or their background, knows that their voice has power. That they are part of the fabric of this nation. The crowd's energy shifted again, swelling with a sense of unity, of shared purpose. They weren't just hearing her, they were feeling her. This was bigger than one woman's stand. This was about the collective rise of a nation's soul, of the American people reclaiming what had been taken from them by those who thought they were untouchable. She paused, the room still. I didn't do this for applause, or for personal gain. I did it for all of us, Crockett finished, her voice rising, her words sharp with an undeniable sense of righteousness. We all deserve better than the system that has held us back for so long. And if we fight together, if we stand together, there is nothing we cannot achieve. And in that moment, it became clear, Jasmine Crockett wasn't just a congresswoman. She had become a symbol. A symbol of resistance against a broken system, a beacon for those who refused to settle for the status quo. Her words became a fire, igniting a movement, one that spread from the streets of Washington to the farthest corners of the country. People were watching. They were listening. And they were finally ready to act. But even as her moment of triumph unfolded, there was something brewing behind the scenes. Soros wasn't the kind of man to sit quietly in defeat. He had lost a battle, but the war was far from over. As the cameras panned out and the applause began to die down, the question lingered: what would Soros do next? This wasn't just a debate. It wasn't just a confrontation between George Soros and Jasmine Crockett. This was a battle for the soul of America, an America where the voices of the people can no longer be drowned out by the privileged few. It's a fight for the ideals we were built on: equality, justice, and the pursuit of dignity for all. And in this moment, we saw the power of one voice standing up to the forces of corruption and greed. But here's the truth: this fight isn't over. It's just beginning. Jasmine Crockett didn't just win this battle, she sparked a movement. A movement that says, enough is enough. A movement that calls for a government that answers to the people, not the billionaires. A movement that believes in dignity over money, justice over privilege. If you believe that dignity should always triumph over corruption, that the voices of the people should never be silenced by power, then this battle is your battle too. You have the power to make a difference. Every tweet, every share, every voice, that's how we move forward, how we make sure the ideals of this country are not just words on paper, but a living, breathing reality. So, I ask you today, will you stand with those who refuse to back down? Will you join the fight for a future where everyone has a voice, where justice is for all, and where dignity is never for sale? If you believe in this cause, if you believe in the future we can build together, subscribe, share, and be part of this movement. Stand with us. Stand with those who will never back down. Together, we can make sure that dignity, justice, and the American dream are for everyone.